The HOA president thought she had power over me, until her own SUV disappeared on the back of a tow truck. Chapter 1: The Warning Notice. It started with a bright orange slip of paper taped under my windshield wiper. The kind of fluorescent warning you couldn't possibly miss, standing out against the otherwise quiet, cookie-cutter rows of houses in my neighborhood. The note wasn't polite, wasn't even professional. Just a bold declaration that my vehicle was in violation of the HOA's rules and would be subject to towing if I didn't correct the issue immediately. The problem? My car was parked directly in front of my own home. Not on the grass. Not blocking a driveway. Not abandoned or left for weeks. Just parked on the curb, where dozens of other neighbors also parked their cars without issue. But there was one difference. My car had become a target. And the person holding the crosshairs was the president of our HOA. A woman named Deborah, though everyone in the neighborhood had their own less than flattering nickname for her. She thrived on rules, thrived on being the authority, thrived on making sure everyone knew she had the final word about what happened on her streets. That slip of paper was her opening shot. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just in a mood. Maybe she'd gotten tired of seeing my car there. Maybe it was an honest mistake. But the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. I had lived in this neighborhood for years, paid my dues without complaint, followed the rules as closely as anyone else. Why was my car suddenly a problem? The answer came soon enough. The following week, I found another notice. This time, taped to my garage door. Another warning, this one stating that if my vehicle remained in its current position, the HOA would exercise its right to have it removed, at my expense. I checked the HOA bylaws. I flipped through every page of that booklet, reading line by line. There it was, a section stating that long-term street parking is prohibited, though nowhere did it specify what long-term meant. Was it hours? Days? Weeks? It was vague enough to give anyone in power room to interpret it however they wanted. And Deborah had made her interpretation clear. She wanted my car gone. The truth was, she'd had her eye on me for a while. I wasn't the type to show up at every HOA meeting and clap for her speeches. I wasn't the kind of neighbor who complimented her perfectly trimmed hedges every time I walked by. I kept to myself, minded my own business, and apparently, that was enough to land me on her radar. Neighbors whispered about her antics all the time. People had been fined for things as trivial as leaving their trash bins out for a few extra hours. Others had gotten letters about their lawn color not being consistent enough. But towing someone's car? That was a new level of pettiness. I decided to test her. One evening, instead of parking in front of my house, I parked 2 doors down. Same curb. Same street. Same situation. The next morning, I checked. Nothing on my car. But my neighbor, whose car had been parked there alongside mine, suddenly had a notice slapped on their windshield. That's when I knew. This wasn't about the rules. This was about Deborah trying to push her weight around. She wasn't applying them equally. She was cherry-picking who to go after, and right now, I was her favorite target. I thought maybe I could reason with her, but every interaction I'd seen between Deborah and anyone else ended the same way, her voice raised, her tone sharp, her body language screaming superiority. There was no reasoning with someone who didn't want to be reasonable. The pressure escalated quickly. Another notice. Then another. And then, finally, a letter in the mail. This one was more official, stamped with the HOA's logo, and written in the cold, bureaucratic language of fines and enforcement. It stated that if my car was not relocated within 72 hours, it would be towed at my expense and I would be responsible for any associated fees. I stared at that letter for a long time, my frustration boiling. I knew I had 2 choices, roll over, accept it, and rearrange my entire life just to avoid her wrath, or push back. I chose the latter. What Deborah didn't realize was that she had left herself vulnerable. For all her chest thumping about the rules, she had a blind spot. And once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Because while she was busy stalking the neighborhood, taping notes to cars and leaving letters in mailboxes, her own vehicle, her pride and joy, a gleaming luxury SUV, was often parked in a very questionable spot. Not just once, but regularly. Directly in front of a fire hydrant. I'd noticed it before, shrugged it off. But now, it became the seed of an idea. The irony was delicious. The HOA president, the self-proclaimed defender of the rules, the self-appointed guardian of property values, blatantly violating an actual city law. Not an HOA bylaw. Not a vague policy. A legitimate, enforceable municipal ordinance. And if the city decided to enforce it? That shiny SUV of hers would be hooked up to a tow truck faster than she could sharpen her next violation notice. The thought made me smile. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tension in my chest ease. Because Deborah wasn't the only one who could play this game. And she was about to learn that lesson the hard way. But before I could make my move, I needed to be patient. I needed to wait for the perfect moment. The neighborhood had an HOA meeting scheduled for the following week. Deborah would, of course, be there, front and center, basking in the sound of her own authority. That meant her car would almost certainly be parked in her usual spot. Which also meant I would have an audience. The kind of audience that would make this revenge sting even more. Because if Deborah wanted to embarrass me, then I was going to embarrass her. And I was going to do it in front of the entire neighborhood. Chapter 2, The Setup. The week between Deborah's last warning letter and the HOA meeting felt like an eternity. Every time I pulled into the neighborhood, I half expected to see a tow truck idling by my curb, waiting to snatch up my car. I took photos of it every night, timestamped, geotagged, just in case I needed evidence that it wasn't abandoned or illegally parked. But I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was planning something bigger. Because Deborah wasn't going to stop. She never did. Once she locked onto a target, she hounded them until they gave up or moved out. And I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. If she wanted a fight, I was ready to give her one, on my terms. The key was her SUV. That gleaming white luxury vehicle she doted on like it was a child. Washed weekly, waxed monthly, sparkling brighter than the sun on a summer afternoon. And parked, like clockwork, in front of the bright yellow fire hydrant near the clubhouse. The hydrant was impossible to miss, painted freshly every spring, city ordinance numbers stenciled neatly on the curb beside it. Everyone else in the neighborhood knew better than to park there. Except Deborah. She always claimed it was just for a few minutes when she ran into the clubhouse for paperwork, or only while unloading supplies. But a few minutes stretched into entire HOA meetings. Hours at a time. The hypocrisy was almost too perfect. I began gathering my evidence carefully. I wanted photos, videos, timestamps, everything that proved this wasn't a one-time slip-up but a consistent violation. So the next time Deborah parked her SUV in front of that hydrant, I was ready. I snapped pictures from every angle, the fire hydrant clearly visible, the city ordinance stenciled on the curb, the SUV blocking it entirely. I checked the clock. Then I waited. 1 hour passed. 2 hours. Nearly 3, before the meeting finally let out and Deborah waltzed out of the clubhouse, heels clicking against the pavement, smug expression plastered across her face. She slid into her SUV like nothing in the world could touch her. Like the rules were for everyone else, not for her. That was the confirmation I needed. But just having evidence wasn't enough. If I reported her to the city anonymously, her car might get ticketed or towed once. She'd pay the fine, shrug it off, and probably double down on her crusade against me. That wasn't the kind of justice I wanted. No, I needed this to sting. I needed it to be public. So I planned around the next HOA meeting. It was the perfect stage. Half the neighborhood usually showed up, tired of Deborah's antics but too intimidated to openly oppose her. What better moment to turn the tables than when she was at her most arrogant, standing at the podium, issuing commands about rules and violations, while her own car sat outside, breaking the law in plain sight. I could already picture it. The gasps, the murmurs, the delicious silence when everyone realized what was happening. But to pull it off, I needed an accomplice, the city itself. That week, I made a call. I explained that a vehicle was repeatedly blocking a fire hydrant, creating a safety hazard. The dispatcher didn't hesitate. They assured me it would be dealt with if it happened again. And I knew it would. The night of the meeting arrived, and everything lined up like clockwork. Neighbors gathered in the clubhouse, folding chairs squeaking as they shifted around the room. Deborah stood at the front, papers in hand, her voice loud and sharp as she recited the latest violations she had so generously uncovered. Trash bins. Lawn heights. Paint colors. And yes, street parking. I sat in the back, calm, collected, waiting. Because outside, just beyond the clubhouse doors, her pristine white SUV sat squarely in front of the hydrant again. And this time, it wasn't just me who had noticed. A few neighbors had whispered about it on their way in. I'd overheard the mutters, "Isn't that against the law? She parks there every time." Figures. And I knew the tow truck was already on its way. I had tipped them off half an hour earlier, providing the exact location, make, and model. By the time Deborah hit the midpoint of her speech, a set of flashing lights cut through the clubhouse windows. Heads turned. Chairs scraped as people stood to look. And then came the sound. The unmistakable rumble of a tow truck engine. For a split second, Deborah faltered. Just for a heartbeat, she lost her rhythm. Then she pushed on, trying to ignore the distraction. But the room was already buzzing, neighbors nudging each other, whispering, pointing toward the window. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. Because I knew what was about to happen next. Chapter 3, The Tow Truck. The hum of the tow truck grew louder until it dominated the room. The headlights swept across the clubhouse walls, and a collective hush fell over the neighbors. Even those who had been nodding along to Deborah's lecture now stood, craning their necks toward the windows. The truck reversed into position with mechanical precision. The beeping as it backed up echoed like a countdown to disaster. Deborah's SUV sat there gleaming, reflecting the flashing lights of the truck, a perfect target. The driver wasted no time. He hopped out, lowered the metal lift, and began securing her tires. The clinking of chains carried into the clubhouse, sharp and unmistakable. Whispers erupted into open murmurs. Everyone knew whose car that was. Everyone knew what it meant. The woman lecturing them on violations, scolding them for breaking rules, was now the one being busted by the city itself. Deborah tried to keep speaking, her voice straining louder, but the words rang hollow. Every eye in the room was fixed on the window, watching as the tow truck lifted the front end of her SUV off the ground. Finally, she couldn't ignore it. She slammed her papers on the podium and stormed toward the doors, heels clacking furiously against the tile. The neighbors followed, some barely hiding their smirks, others openly chuckling as they trailed behind her. Outside, the tow truck operator was already finishing his work. The SUV tilted upward, headlights staring helplessly at the sky, before being hauled fully into the air. Deborah exploded. Her voice pierced the night, shrill and indignant. She demanded the driver stop, waving her arms like she could command the situation back under control. But the driver remained calm, pointing at the hydrant, explaining something that made her face turn an ugly shade of red. It was obvious, she had no defense. She was in the wrong, and the law was not bending for her. The neighbors stood in a loose semicircle, watching the scene unfold like it was free theater. Phones came out, recording every moment. The mighty HOA president, red-faced, sputtering, powerless, as her beloved SUV was carted off like a misbehaving child. She shouted about mistakes and exceptions. She threw around the word emergency, claiming she needed quick access to the clubhouse. But it didn't matter. The hydrant was clear, the ordinance was obvious, and the tow truck had a job to do. Within minutes, her SUV was gone, disappearing down the street, taillights fading into the dark. And Deborah was left standing there, shaking with fury, surrounded by neighbors who were no longer afraid of her. The meeting never resumed. People drifted off, whispering and laughing as they went home. The image of Deborah, powerless and embarrassed, was burned into their minds. For me, the satisfaction was overwhelming. Weeks of her harassment, undone in a single, perfect act of poetic justice. But I knew this wasn't the end. Because Deborah wasn't the type to lick her wounds and move on. She was the type to retaliate. And sure enough, the very next day, the real fallout began. Chapter 4, The Retaliation. By sunrise, Deborah's SUV was back in her driveway, freshly retrieved from the impound lot. But the woman who stepped out of it wasn't the same smug president from the day before. She was humiliated, bitter, and ready for war. The first sign came in the form of a neighborhood-wide email. Sent at 6 in the morning, it was addressed to all residents but written like a direct attack. She spoke of sabotage, disrespect, and those who undermined the community's values. She didn't name me directly, but everyone knew. Within hours, another letter appeared in my mailbox. This one bristled with threats, fines, penalties, even talk of escalating legal action. She referenced my car again, claiming it was still in violation, her language dripping with venom. But here's the thing about Deborah, she thrived on intimidation, not truth. Her letters looked scary, but they had no bite. I'd already checked the bylaws inside and out. She could harass me, but she couldn't touch me, at least not without twisting the rules beyond recognition. And that's exactly what she tried to do. For the next week, I became her obsession. Every day brought a new warning. A complaint about my trash bins. A notice about my lawn height. A letter claiming my front porch light was too dim. Petty, laughable accusations, stacked one on top of the other. But she miscalculated. Because while she was busy waging her little war against me, the rest of the neighborhood was still buzzing from the tow truck incident. Videos of her SUV being hauled away had circulated like wildfire. Neighbors who once feared her now openly mocked her. Even those who used to tolerate her began questioning why she was still in charge. The balance had shifted. And I didn't need to fight her alone anymore. Neighbors began confiding in me, sharing their own stories of Deborah's harassment. The elderly couple down the street fined for having improperly stored hoses. The young family penalized because their kids left chalk drawings on the sidewalk. The single mom cited 4 noise violations after hosting a birthday party. For years, Deborah had gotten away with it because everyone felt isolated. She made them believe they were alone. But now? Now they saw the truth. And they were ready to do something about it. Chapter 5, The Turning Tide. The HOA meeting scheduled 2 weeks later was unlike any other. Normally, Deborah stood at the front, towering over the room, dictating her will. But this time, the room buzzed with quiet rebellion. Neighbors came prepared. Papers in hand, screenshots of fines, photos of her SUV parked illegally. They weren't here to listen. They were here to confront. I didn't have to say much. I simply sat near the front, my presence enough to remind everyone of the tow truck incident. The proof of her hypocrisy had already been burned into their minds. When the meeting began, Deborah tried to launch into her usual routine. But within minutes, she was interrupted. A neighbor stood up, waving a stack of violation notices. Another followed, recounting years of harassment. Then another, and another. The dam had broken. What had once been whispered complaints were now loud, public accusations. Deborah's voice shook as she tried to regain control, but the harder she fought, the worse it looked. Her composure crumbled, her authority slipping with every word. Finally, someone proposed the unthinkable, a vote of no confidence. The room erupted. Hands shot up. Voices shouted in agreement. The bylaws were clear, an HOA president could be removed if enough members supported it. And in that moment, the tide was unstoppable. Deborah's face went pale. She protested, raged, threatened. But it didn't matter. The neighbors she had tormented for years had finally found their voice. And by the end of the night, the vote was unanimous. Deborah was out. Chapter 6, The Aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Without Deborah's iron grip, the HOA relaxed. The petty fines stopped. The threats disappeared. For the first time in years, people actually felt comfortable in their own homes. Deborah, meanwhile, vanished from public view. Her SUV sat untouched in her driveway, a monument to her downfall. She avoided eye contact, never attended meetings, never patrolled the streets again. Her reign was over. As for me, I parked my car right back in front of my house. No slips. No warnings. No threats. It sat there, day after day, untouched. And every time I walked past that bright yellow fire hydrant near the clubhouse, I smiled. Because that was where it all had changed. That was where the queen of petty rules had been dethroned by her own arrogance. And that was where I learned the sweetest lesson of all: sometimes, the best revenge isn't just getting even. It's showing the whole world that the tyrant was never untouchable in the first place.